I knew things were about to get ridiculous the moment I spotted my private property sign floating down the creek like it had finally decided to quit its job. I'm not even kidding. There it was, slowly drifting through the water, bumping against rocks, spinning in lazy circles while I stood on the bank, holding a cup of coffee and wondering how many bad decisions could fit into one neighborhood. The crazy part wasn't that the sign was gone. The crazy part was that deep down, I already knew who had taken it. A little over a year earlier, I bought a piece of land outside a small community called Cedar Hollow. Not inside it, not governed by it, just next to it. My property sat beyond the neighborhood entrance, separated by an old county road and a stretch of woods. It was exactly what I wanted after 20 years of corporate work and city traffic. Quiet mornings, no crowds, no meetings, just trees, wildlife, and a beautiful creek running through the back portion of the property. The creek was what sold me on the place. According to the deed, I owned a section running from an old stone culvert all the way down to a massive sycamore tree near the southern boundary. It wasn't shared land. It wasn't community property. It wasn't subject to any easement that allowed public access. It belonged to me. Now, normally, nobody would care. Unfortunately, Cedar Hollow had an HOA, and Cedar Hollow's HOA had Patricia Holloway. Patricia was one of those people who somehow managed to smile and look annoyed at the same time. Mid-50s, perfectly styled hair, oversized sunglasses, and a habit of carrying a clipboard everywhere she went. I don't know what was on that clipboard. Maybe rules. Maybe grocery lists. Maybe the names of people she planned to bother that week. What I do know is that she acted like she had jurisdiction over every blade of grass within 3 miles. The first time we met, she introduced herself before I'd even finished unloading furniture. "Welcome to the area," she said. "Just so you know, most homeowners around here maintain a more consistent appearance." I remember looking around because I genuinely thought she was talking about landscaping. Then she pointed at my truck. My truck. Apparently, she didn't like the color. That should have been my warning sign. Over the following months, little things started happening. Notes appeared in my mailbox suggesting improvements. Suggestions about my shed. Suggestions about my driveway. Suggestions about outdoor lighting. None of it made any sense because I wasn't part of the HOA. At first, I laughed it off. Then it became annoying. It became weird. One afternoon, she actually stopped while I was repairing a fence post and informed me that my mailbox didn't meet community standards. I looked at her and said, "Good thing I don't live in your community." You would have thought I insulted her family. After that, things became noticeably colder. Every conversation carried a little edge. Every interaction felt like she was waiting for me to admit she had authority she didn't actually possess. Then came the creek. The morning I found the floating sign, I followed the water downstream, expecting to find storm damage or maybe a fallen branch. Instead, I found something else. 3 folding chairs, a large cooler, a portable speaker playing soft jazz, and Patricia sitting comfortably on my creek bank with 2 of her HOA friends fishing like they own the place. I stopped walking. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was somehow standing on the wrong property. Patricia turned around, saw me, and smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people use when they think they've already won an argument. "Oh, good morning," she called out. One of the women beside her raised a soda can in my direction like we were all attending the same picnic. I looked around at the chairs, the fishing rods, the trash bag hanging from a tree branch. Then I said, "What exactly are you doing?" Patricia removed her sunglasses. "We're enjoying the creek." I nodded slowly. "My creek." She laughed. Not nervous laughter. Dismissive laughter. "Well," she said, "the residents voted to make it available for community recreation." I just stared at her. For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I'd heard. The residents voted, that's right. I remember blinking twice. Then I asked the obvious question. How exactly does your HOA vote away property it doesn't own? The smile never left her face. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion. Somewhere along the line, Patricia Holloway had convinced herself that if she acted like she owned something long enough, reality would eventually agree with her. What I didn't know yet was that this little fishing trip was only the tip of the iceberg, because later that afternoon, after I pulled up footage from my security cameras, I was about to discover just how far she and the HOA had already gone. What I didn't know yet was that this little fishing trip was only the tip of the iceberg, because later that afternoon, after I pulled up footage from my security cameras, I was about to discover just how far she and the HOA had already gone. Now, I've always been a pretty private person. That's one of the reasons I bought the property in the first place. But being private doesn't mean being naive. A few years earlier, I dealt with some equipment theft at another property. So when I moved to Cedar Hollow's outskirts, I installed a camera system that covered most of the land around the house and portions of the creek. Not because I expected trouble, but because cameras are cheaper than regrets. That evening, I sat down on my kitchen table, opened a footage archive, and started scrolling backward. At first, I was looking for whoever removed the sign. Instead, I found something that made me put my coffee down. 3 weeks earlier, Patricia was standing near the creek with two men I'd seen at HOA meetings. One of them was holding a chainsaw. I watched the video twice because I honestly couldn't believe it. Then I watched them cut down one of my dogwood trees. Not trim it, not remove dead branches. Cut the entire thing down. The tree hit the ground, and the three of them immediately started dragging sections of it away, like they were cleaning up evidence from a crime scene. I leaned back in my chair. Are you kidding me? I kept watching. 2 days later, another video showed them unloading several wheelbarrows full of gravel along the creek bank. The next clip showed wooden posts, then rope, then a swing. A literal rope swing hanging from another tree on my property. The deeper I went into the footage, the worse it got. Families were using the creek every weekend. Kids splashing in the water. Adults drinking beer. Coolers. Camp chairs. Picnics. Someone even brought a portable grill. They had essentially turned my creek into an unofficial HOA park without ever asking permission. And suddenly a much bigger concern hit me. Liability. Because all it takes is one kid falling off that swing, one broken arm, one accident near the water, and suddenly lawyers start asking who owns the property. Me. Not Patricia. Not the HOA. Me. The irritation I'd been feeling for months transformed into something colder. This wasn't nosy neighbor behavior anymore. This was deliberate, systematic, calculated. I spent the next 2 hours exporting footage. Every video, every timestamp, every incident. Then I made a phone call. My friend Rebecca Morales answered on the second ring. Rebecca and I had known each other since college. Back then, she was the smartest person in every room and somehow still managed to be the funniest. These days, she specialized in property law. After I explained the situation, she said 3 words. Send everything over. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Rebecca didn't sound surprised. She sounded excited, which is usually bad news for whoever is on the other side of a lawsuit. You got them on video cutting trees? Yep. Installing structures? Yep. Using the property repeatedly every weekend. There was a pause. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny, because legally speaking, Patricia had apparently stepped on every rake available. David, she said, this is one of the cleanest property cases I've seen in years. The next call went to the sheriff's office. The deputy who arrived the following afternoon was named Marcus Hale. Big guy, calm voice, the kind of person who didn't seem impressed by much. We sat on my porch while he reviewed the footage. For several minutes, he didn't say anything. Then the chainsaw clip appeared. His eyebrows rose. Then came the gravel. Then the swing. Then the families. Then Patricia, sitting in one of the chairs, waving at the camera. Deputy Hale slowly exhaled. Well, that's what I said. He looked at me. How long has this been going on? Apparently months. Another pause. Then he asked something I hadn't fully considered yet. Do you want to pursue charges? I looked toward the creek. The honest answer was that I hated conflict. I really did. Most people imagine lawsuits as satisfying. They're not. They're stressful. They're expensive. They're exhausting. But what bothered me wasn't the property damage. It was the arrogance. The assumption that my rights didn't matter because a group of people had convinced themselves they were in charge. So I answered honestly. Yeah, you do. Deputy Hale nodded. Then let's document everything. That evening, Rebecca called again. And that's when the entire situation somehow became even crazier. David, she said, I pulled the county records. Okay, I need you to sit down. I laughed. I am sitting down. Good, because your property isn't even inside the HOA boundary. I frowned. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. Their jurisdiction ends almost 600 feet before your property line begins. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I started laughing. Not because it was funny, Because it was absurd. All those letters, all those warnings, all those complaints. Months of Patricia acting like some suburban queen issuing decrees from her clipboard kingdom. And legally, she had absolutely zero authority over me. None. Rebecca continued. They cannot regulate your property, right? They cannot fine you, right? They cannot create rules for your land, right? And they definitely cannot vote to open your creek. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly, every interaction I'd had with Patricia looked different. This wasn't an overzealous HOA president. This was someone who had become addicted to authority. Someone who'd spent so much time telling people what to do that she'd forgotten authority actually has limits. The following morning, Rebecca filed paperwork requesting an injunction while I submitted formal trespassing complaints. At the same time, we documented every damaged area along the creek. The stump, the gravel, the swing, the altered bank, everything. And then something unexpected happened. Word started spreading. Fast. Apparently, news travels through suburban neighborhoods faster than wildfire. 2 days later, I was unloading groceries when my next-door neighbor, an older guy named Walter Jenkins, walked across the road carrying a coffee mug. "You really reported Patricia?" I nodded. Walter grinned. "About damn time." That surprised me. I asked what he meant. Walter looked around to make sure nobody else was listening. Then he spent 20 minutes telling me stories. Question of Elfinas, threats, selective enforcement, board members getting special treatment, rules that somehow only applied to certain residents. When he finished, he wasn't smiling anymore. "You know," he said quietly, "a lot of people have wanted someone to stand up to them." That conversation turned into another, then another, then another. Within a week, people I had barely met were sharing emails, letters, notices, and complaints. Patterns started emerging. Not mistakes. Patterns. And the more evidence we collected, the clearer the picture became. Patricia wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was controlling it. The problem for her was that once people stop being afraid, they start talking. And once they start talking, they start comparing notes. And when that happened, the foundation beneath Cedar Hollow's leadership began cracking faster than anyone could have imagined. The real collapse started 3 days later during an emergency HOA meeting. A meeting Patricia believed would save her position, but instead became the beginning of the end. The real collapse started 3 days later during an emergency HOA meeting. A meeting Patricia believed would save her position, but instead became the beginning of the end. I didn't attend. Honestly, I didn't need to. Rebecca went on my behalf, carrying enough documents to make a small tree nervous. Property records, survey maps, photographs, video stills, trespassing reports, everything neatly organized in binders. Later, she told me the atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt tense before the meeting even started. People were whispering. Board members were avoiding eye contact. Residents were showing up in numbers nobody expected. Patricia apparently walked into the room trying to project confidence. But confidence is hard to fake when half the neighborhood is staring at you like they're waiting for answers. According to Rebecca, Patricia opened the meeting by claiming misinformation was being spread about the HOA. That lasted about 4 minutes. Then Rebecca stood up. One binder hit the table. Then another. Then another. She calmly presented the property surveys, proving my land was never part of Cedar Hollow. She presented the video evidence, the photographs, the complaints, the trespassing reports. Every time Patricia tried to interrupt, Rebecca simply slid another document across the table. By the end of the presentation, nobody was arguing anymore. People were just staring. The first board member resigned before the meeting even ended. A second member claimed she had never approved any activity near the creek. A third suddenly remembered he had a family emergency and left through a side door. The unity Patricia had relied on for years evaporated in less than an hour. But the truly interesting part happened afterward. Because once residents realized the leadership wasn't untouchable, they started asking questions they should have been asking years earlier. Questions about budgets. Questions about expenditures. Questions about reimbursements. Questions about where HOA money was actually going. At first, nobody expected anything major. Maybe some sloppy bookkeeping. Maybe poor management. Nothing unusual. Then someone requested financial records. Then someone else started reviewing invoices. Then another resident happened to be an accountant. And suddenly people were finding things. Lots of things. equipment purchases that couldn't be verified, contractor payments linked to companies nobody could locate, maintenance expenses that appeared multiple times under different descriptions, thousands of dollars moving through accounts with almost no oversight. The deeper they looked, the uglier it became. Meanwhile, county officials were conducting their own review because of the creek modifications. That's when another problem surfaced. The gravel Patricia's group, dumped along the bank, had altered part of a protected runoff channel. Nobody had permits. Nobody had approvals. Nobody had environmental authorization. What started as a property dispute was now attracting attention from multiple agencies. The pressure was building from every direction. A week later, I noticed a white SUV parked near my property. The driver sat there for nearly 20 minutes taking photographs. Didn't approach me. Didn't speak. Just took pictures and left. Well, I told Rebecca. She laughed. They're fishing. For what? For anything they can use against you. Apparently, the HOA had requested a property review, hoping to find violations on my land. The plan was simple. Create a distraction. Shift the narrative. Made me look like the problem. Unfortunately for them, reality wasn't cooperating. The county inspector showed up 2 days later. We walked the property together. He checked structures, property lines, drainage, permits. The entire inspection took less than 30 minutes. Finally, he closed his folder. Everything looks fine. I smiled. Good to hear. Then he pointed towards Cedar Hollow. Can't say the same over there. As it turned out, the community garden maintained by the HOA extended nearly 20 feet beyond its approved boundary. One violation led to another, then another, then another, and suddenly the spotlight wasn't on me anymore. It was squarely on Patricia and the board. The state investigation began shortly afterward. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records were requested. Email archives were reviewed. Residents who had once stayed silent started cooperating. And once investigators gained access to the financial records, the whole thing unraveled frighteningly fast. Several reimbursements had been approved for equipment that didn't exist. Certain vendors appeared connected to board members. Invoices contained inconsistencies that were impossible to explain. Money had been moving around with astonishing carelessness. Looking back, I think Patricia genuinely believed nobody would ever check. For years, nobody had. Then one person pushed back. One person asked for proof. And the entire structure started collapsing under its own weight. The morning of Patricia's arrest was strangely ordinary. No dramatic chase, no television cameras, no shouting, just 2 investigators arriving at her house shortly after sunrise. A few neighbors watched from their windows. Others pretended not to. Within 20 minutes, Patricia was escorted outside in handcuffs. The same woman who once walked around the neighborhood issuing warnings now stood silently beside a government vehicle. No clipboard, no speeches, no authority, just consequences. The remaining cases moved quickly after that. Several board members accepted settlements. Others resigned permanently. Civil claims were resolved. Restoration costs were awarded. Legal fees were reimbursed. The court ordered compensation for the property damage and mandated full remediation of the creek area. From a legal perspective, we won everything we'd asked for. But oddly enough, that wasn't the most satisfying part. The most satisfying part happened several weeks later. Residents gathered for a community meeting. A real one this time. No intimidación, no threats, no manufactured authority. Just neighbors talking honestly. Near the end of the meeting, someone proposed removing the remaining leadership and restructuring the entire HOA. The vote wasn't even close. It passed unanimously. Years of fear disappeared in a matter of minutes. And just like that, the organization that had spent so much time controlling others was finally forced to answer to the people it claimed to represent. A few months later, I walked down to the creek near sunset. The gravel was gone. The swing was gone. The damaged areas had been restored. The water moved quietly through the trees, exactly the way it had before any of this started. I stood there for a while listening to the current, thinking, because the truth is, none of this began with a chainsaw. None of it began with lawsuits, or investigations, or arrests. It started with something much smaller. A person believing the rules applied differently to them. A community choosing silence because speaking up felt uncomfortable. And a lot of people convincing themselves that authority must be legitimate simply because it sounded official. That lesson stayed with me. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a neighborhood isn't a criminal. It's unchecked power wrapped in good intentions and official language. Because the moment nobody questions it, boundaries start disappearing. Property boundaries, personal boundaries, moral boundaries. And by the time people finally notice, the damage is usually much bigger than anyone expected. So now I'm curious. If you discovered your neighbors were using your property like it belonged to them, backed by an HOA that acted like it could rewrite ownership with a vote, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them immediately, ignored it, and hoped it stopped? Or gone straight to legal action the moment you found proof? Let me know in the comments because situations like this spark some pretty strong opinions. And honestly, I'd love to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with HOA drama, abuse of authority, or a dispute that started small and spiraled completely out of control, share your story too. Sometimes the best lessons come from comparing experiences. And trust me, after everything that happened at Cedar Hollow, I've learned that the line between a peaceful neighborhood and a full-blown legal disaster is a lot thinner than most people think.